Is Iowa's Lukas Van Ness one of the top pass rushers in the draft, or would he be a massive reach for the Falcons at 8? It's Mock Draft Monday. Let's get it.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. It's Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and of course, your very humble host to this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta. And today's episode is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. If you've ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your football franchise, then this is the game definitely for you. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. Our listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code Locked On in all caps in the game store. And guys, I want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, it's free and available. Subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast, and check us out on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV by downloading the Locked On Sports Atlanta app on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV. So today is a Mock Draft Monday where we look at a recent mock draft and break down the prospect that is mocked to the Falcons with the 8th overall draft selection. We'll get into that coming up on today's episode. Later in the episode, we'll talk about the moves that the Falcons are making at the outset of the second wave of free agency and what do they do about their wide receiver hole opposite Drake London. And then we'll answer a couple of listener questions about sort of Thomas Dimitrov's place in Falcons GM history, especially now in light of the money to Chris Lindstrom, and we'll get a little bit more into the contract details of Chris Lindstrom's contract. But without further ado, let's get into the Mock Draft Monday portion of today's episode. On a recent episode, I talked about how I now believe, based off of the first week of free agency, that the Falcons are poised to take a pass rusher, an edge rusher at the top of round 1 in with the 8th overall draft selection. So let's, talk about one potential option for the Falcons with that 8th overall selection. We look at a mock draft from Josh Edwards of CBS Sports that I believe he put out either Friday or Saturday.
The 8th pick, the Atlanta Falcons select.
With the 8th pick, Lukas Van Ness, defensive end from the University of Iowa in Josh Edwards' mock draft, a 6'5", 272-pound power pass rusher from Iowa that declared as a redshirt sophomore. He's been seemingly a rising player since declaring for the draft, with folks like Dane Brugler and Daniel Jeremiah ranking him ahead of Clemson pass rusher Myles Murphy, who we broke down on the first Mock Draft Monday back in February. And they've been consistently ranking him and mocking him ahead of Myles Murphy for the last several weeks. Jeremiah did a pre-combine mock that had the Falcons taking Van Ness at 8 back in February. And the thing that Van Ness brings to the table is athleticism. He scored a 9.36 RAS or RAS, or relative athletic score, based off his combine metrics. Tested really well in the agilities, tested well in the speed scores. His 3-cone was a 7.02 second 3-cone. That's 80th percentile for pass rushers. And I always got to remind you guys that there's a pretty decent correlation. I won't say strong correlation, but decent correlation between sack production in the NFL for first-round pass rushers and their 3-cone time. Now, Van Ness's explosives, his jumps were not quite as good, only 24th percentile in the vertical jump. However, 63rd percentile in the broad jump is impressive. And so while he does check the athleticism box, how does he win? He wins with power. He's a bull rush, bull rush, bull rush, bull rush. That's all he does. He'll line up on the outside. He'll line up on the inside, both sides of the line, of the defensive line, left, right side, inside, all that and more. And he can use a bull rush from any level of that. He was very effective, beating Big Ten tackles, even NFL caliber Big Ten tackles like Ohio State's Paris Johnson Jr., Michigan's Ryan Hayes this past year with that bull rush. I didn't see him do as well against Peter Skoronski, the Northwestern offensive tackle, using that bull rush. He did try a spin move against Peter Skoronski in that Northwestern game. Very awkward. And that's kind of the knock on Lukas Van Ness. He's kind of a one-note bull rusher. Basically, he knows how to use that bull rush, get his hands inside, get that extension, drive his legs, and collapse the pocket. But when it comes to disengaging from blocks, when it comes to using really any other move, I just haven't seen it in the 4 or 5 games that I've watched from Lukas Van Ness. And so if I can be absolutely frank with you guys, I do not see Lukas Van Ness as a top 10, top 15 caliber talent that he is currently being mocked as and ranked as by certain, high level big draft people like Dane Brugler and Daniel Jeremiah. He's more the type of player that I think typically gets drafted, in the bottom 10 of the first round. That team is going to take a flyer on just because his traits, he tested well, like a Peyton Turner, who the Saints picked up a couple of years ago. It's going back to the Falcons taking Takk McKinley in that 2017 draft. Bet on the traits at the end of round 1, and maybe you can coach him up. But if you're going to make a case for why you're going to draft Lukas Van Ness, the case is going to be that he's inexperienced. He only played 2 years at Iowa, came out as a redshirt freshman. Now that's related to the whole notion you'll hear a lot of people talk about for some ridiculous reason. Oh, he didn't start at Iowa. What's that all about? It's like, well, because Iowa doesn't start underclassmen. They start only upperclassmen. That's just the way they run their program. So when I hear people talk about him not starting as if that's like a legit concern that you have to investigate, like, no, you're a brain dead idiot. It just takes you 30 seconds to figure out, oh, what Iowa has just quirky rule that they just don't start the best players. They start the upperclassmen, the guys that have been in a program longer than that. It's like a reward for their program. Like, it's not some great mystery of being like, what does this mean about him as a football player? Sorry, just I just hear like various people talk about, well, he didn't start. Like, who cares? Like, no one, like, if you're making that a part of your evaluation of him as a prospect, I just sit here and go, like, you're a brain dead idiot. Like, move on. Like, find something else to really talk about. But the point is, sorry for going in that way, but the point is, like, right, the real issue with him is the lack of polish, the lack of moves. And if you're going to bet on Lukas Van Ness, it's going to be bet on, well, he doesn't have those things because he's only been, working on his game for 2 seasons, right? And it's very similar to what Solomon Thomas went through when he was a top 3 pick back in 2017 with the 49ers coming out of Stanford. Solomon Thomas was a similar size, very athletic guy, but he was more of like a 3-4 defensive end in Stanford scheme, came out as a 21-year-old sophomore like Lukas Van Ness. And, I kind of saw Solomon Thomas, my personal opinion was he was an undersized D tackle that just hadn't been in college enough to put on the bulk that he needed to get up to like 290, 295 that he needed to be. But the NFL was like, no, let's make him an edge rusher. He struggled for 4 years in San Francisco, kind of been a journeyman the last couple of years now, I think, with the Jets. And while I compare Lukas Van Ness to that, I'm not necessarily saying Van Ness is going to be a bust in that regard, but I just cannot in good conscience justify taking a player like Lukas Van Ness in the top 10. So it's really even hard for me to entertain the idea of the Falcons taking him at 8. To me, if you were going to take him at 25, that makes sense to me. But at 8, it just does not make sense to me. So we'll see if this is a selection that we start to gain traction on over the course of the next 5 to 6 weeks, and whether we start to hear more smoke about the Falcons potentially targeting a player like Lukas Van Ness. But to me personally, this is a massive reach for me at this point to take him at 8. Take him in the 20s, okay, but in terms of pulling the trigger at 8, it's hard for me to wrap my brain around. I don't see it with Lukas Van Ness as that level of prospect. Like, it's just hard to me to look at Lukas Van Ness and then look at players like Jermaine Johnson and George Karlaftis that were taken at 26 last year for Johnson and 31 for Karlaftis last year. Like, those guys are better prospects to me than Lukas Van Ness is at this point in time. And so, like, I just cannot understand how NFL teams could value Lukas Van Ness over those guys coming out of school. That's just me, but we'll just sort of have to see. But that's going to do it for us with the Lukas Van Ness conversation. Good player, but just you will not see me get on board with the idea of Lukas Van Ness between now and the draft is basically what I'm going to sit here and tell you guys. So we will leave that aside and we will move on to talk about the second wave of free agency, which is now beginning. And what now is the question going to be for the Falcons at the wide receiver position? Are they going to sign someone or are they going to make a trade? We'll go through some of the options as the second wave of free agency unfolds as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But guys, I know a lot of you, are feeling great about the Falcons' first week of free agent moves. Maybe some of you are feeling down about the Falcons' first week of free agency moves. I'm guessing the Venn diagram kind of matches up with how you feel about the quarterback situation. The better you feel about Ritter being the quarterback, probably the better you feel about this first week is sort of the correlation and thing that I've seen going for so far. But all that to say is, like, there's still a lot more GMing to be done by the Atlanta Falcons. And I know you guys can get your GM fix by downloading the fun new mobile game, The Ultimate Football GM. You can hire coaches, make trades, navigate through free agency. It's a challenging, realistic game world. It's completely free, playable offline. All you have to do is go to the website ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. And when you do download the game, make sure you use the promo code locked on, LOCKEDON, in all caps in the game store, and you'll get 100% free boost to your team. Again, that's promo code locked on in all caps. All you got to do is download the game at ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. So, guys, continuing today's episode, let's talk about the moves that the Falcons made over the weekend. Just some low-key free agent signings. They did re-sign cornerback Cornell Armstrong on Saturday. They did have a visit from free agent cornerback Mike Hughes over the weekend as well. They signed linebacker Tae Davis on Friday. He was a special teams player for the Browns, a former teammate of Kadero Hodge when he was a special teams player for the Browns. Most likely, Tae Davis is replacing Nick Kwiatkowski on special teams. Basically, they played the same spot on punt coverage for the Falcons last year, and Davis with the Browns in previous years. We'll see what happens with Rashaan Evans, but hoping that the Falcons move on from Rashaan Evans and are just looking to shore up depth there at that linebacker position. But this is sort of the moves that you start to make right when kind of the first wave of free agency is done, usually the first 5 days or so. And that second wave of free agency is where you can start to get some of the bargains, because usually all the big money has sort of been thrown around, and most of the guys that are going to land big money have been signed. The exceptions now are like Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, Dalton Schultz, Bobby Wagner. Some of those big name guys are still out there. But, I feel like this is the time where we'll start to see the Falcons, starting with Cornell Armstrong, start to re-sign some of their current free agents, players like Kadero Hodge, Elijah Wilkinson, Damiere Byrd, Kobe Gossett, Mike Ford, Chuma Edoga, Eric Harris. We'll see if they can land a guy like Olamide Zaccheaus. I went into free agency feeling about 50-50. And I feel a little bit better that they'll be able to retain Zaccheaus just because no other team in the early phase of free agency, went out there and paid him money to be their starter. And so I feel like the Falcons should be able to get him at reasonable number 3 wide receiver money. But we still don't really have an answer for the Falcons at the number 2 wide receiver spot. They did pursue Darius Slayton. He wound up choosing to go back to the Giants. And so with, some of the signings that have already been made, it's getting thin there at the wide receiver position. You still have, injury prone players like DJ Chark and Adam Thielen out there available. Saw some reports on Sunday that those guys are potentially going to be targets for the Carolina Panthers. Mecole Hardman, who I think is a good replacement for Olamide Zaccheaus if the Falcons don't re-sign him, but it's more like OZ, more of a number 3 than a true number 2. I think really you're kind of waiting to see how this Aaron Rodgers Jets situation gets resolved, because you're wanting to see what happens with Corey Davis, right? And it's long been suspected that the Jets will move on from Corey Davis, and it's long been suspected that they would cut Corey Davis, but I've heard some grumblings that he may be part of the package that the New York Jets send to Green Bay in exchange for Aaron Rodgers. Now the Jets have added basically Alan Lazard. I'm sorry. Now Corey Davis is also like DJ Chark and Adam Thielen, injury prone, but at least he's been productive in the Arthur Smith scheme. So we'll see if the Jets wind up cutting him or trading him to Green Bay. Obviously, if he gets cut, you got to imagine the Falcons going to be all over that. But if they aren't able to land Corey Davis because he's traded to Green Bay or he decides to sign with somebody else after he gets cut, the market does become a lot thinner in terms of viable number 2 receiver options. You have another injury prone player like Kenny Golladay, who was a disaster in New York. Maybe you can look at him as a cheap reclamation project. But I think in free agency, it's looking thin. Basically, we're hoping for Corey Davis. I think really at that point, the best alternative for the Falcons is to make a trade. And some of the various players that I've heard are potentially on the trade block are DeAndre Hopkins with the Arizona Cardinals. Obviously, that's a prominent name. I don't know if the Falcons are going to be in the market for an older wide receiver like DeAndre Hopkins, but obviously, DeAndre Hopkins is more than a number 2 receiver. Cortland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy are allegedly, the Broncos will answer phone calls about those guys via trade. Yeah, I mean, they make some sense in a certain degree. I think the Rams will certainly answer the phone call when it comes to Allen Robinson or Van Jefferson. I've heard he's entering a contract year similar to Jerry Jeudy, and I don't know if those teams want to pay him. Hunter Renfrow is another player that is allegedly being shopped by the Raiders. Tyler Boyd is supposedly someone that the Bengals will answer phone calls are. He's entering his contract year, and with the Bengals likely to pay Jamar Chase and T. Higgins in the near future, may want to look to unload him in order to free up some of that cap space. The Jets may also be looking to deal Denzel Mims, who has basically done nothing in the couple of years that he's been in New York. And so he could be a worthwhile reclamation project for a team like the Falcons. But, if the Falcons don't land one of these veterans here via trade or via free agent signing, it does sort of push up the wide receiver need at the top of the draft, not to the degree where it's really entertaining it as a possibility at 8. I've seen a lot of people throw around Jackson Smith and Jigba, the Ohio State receiver's name, quite a bit over the last week, which, is not going to happen. But certainly I think it's in the mix to be the Falcons pick at the top of round 2 at pick 44, and probably 2 players that I would probably look at as guys that I could definitely see the Falcons targeting with that 44th overall selection would be SMU wide receiver Rashid Rice or Cincinnati wide receiver Tyler Scott, who certainly brings a little bit more speed. Rice is a little bit more of that contested catch, bigger body, chain mover type, and Scott is more the guy that could sort of take the top off of a defense. And my personal preference would be for a player like Scott over a player like Rice, but knowing the Falcons and they just want someone who can go out there and block and win in contested catch situations is sort of their MO for wide receivers. And Rashid Rice definitely checks those boxes, but we'll see how that goes. We'll keep an eye on this wide receiver market as the week unfolds. But the rest of today's episode, we'll be talking a little bit more about Terry Fontenot and if he's done enough to catch Thomas Dimitroff as the top GM in Falcons history, and how do we sort of assess Thomas Dimitroff's legacy in light of the new money for offensive linemen Chris Lindstrom and Caleb McGarry. And we'll get into that as we continue today's episode. But guys, I know some of your brackets have been busted. Some of your brackets are doing pretty well. And regardless of which side you fall on, you might want to go over to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Download the app. It's safe, secure, super easy to use. And if you're new to FanDuel, you'll get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000, which means that you get bonus bets back even if your first bet does not win. And so if your bracket's doing well, you want to ride this hot streak, right? And maximize this hot streak, this luck streak that you're on. And if your bracket has been busted and you're doing poorly, well, you want to get something back, and you can do so by heading over to FanDuel and putting some money down for March Madness. And make sure you take advantage of that no sweat first bet up to $1,000 and bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So we are wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons Mock Draft Monday with a Mailbag Monday. And our first question comes from the Discord at SebsDad19. He asked, does the stigma of Thomas Dimitroff not finding offensive line talent go away after the recent resignings of McGarry and Lindstrom? Can we consider Thomas Dimitroff the best general manager in Falcons history currently? Well, to answer your second question first, yes, Dimitroff is the best general manager in Falcons history. Who else is in the running, right? Rich McKay, Terry Fontenot. Like, until Terry Fontenot has 5 winning seasons under his belt, I don't think he's really in the conversation to be the best general manager in Falcons history. Even with some of us, myself included, singing his praises after this first week of free agency. Signing Jesse Bates does not make you the best general manager in Falcons history. Now, for your first question, it depends on your perspective. It's really up to you whether or not the stigma against Thomas Dimitroff goes away, right? Do you think it should go away? Right. If you don't think it should go away, then you can continue to hammer TD for bad offensive line picks like Peter Kahns and Lamar Holmes, or bad free agent signings like Brandon Fusco, James Carpenter, Jamon Brown. Or if you do feel like it should go away, then you can give him credit for signings like Alex Mack or drafting Chris Lindstrom, Jake Matthews, Caleb McGarry, all that more. So it's really a choice, right? And this is one of the things I've learned going to therapy, is that you can only control the things that you control, and the things that I can control is how good this podcast is. I can't really control whether or not the Falcons make the decisions that I think they should make, right? And like for me, it's one of those things where like you can control how you feel about a player or a person. I'll use another example beyond Thomas Dimitroff. Like look at Keanu Neal. Right after the Falcons signed Jesse Bates, I saw a lot of people on Twitter saying like, "Oh, this is the best, safety the Falcons have had since Thomas Deku," or "This is when was the last time the Falcons had a star safety like Jesse Bates?" And like, I responded to those people on Twitter being like, "Hey, you guys are forgetting Keanu Neal." And I got a couple of responses from people being like, hashtag knee ball or whatever, referring to that 2017 playoff game against the Eagles where he almost had an interception and it got deflected. Of course, all you guys know what I'm talking about. But for the three of you in the audience that don't know what that knee ball is referring to, but like you choose whether or not that's what your memory of Keanu Neal is. Like that's an arbitrary choice to make about, oh, he need that ball in the playoff game, or you could just as easily choose that your most visible memory of Keanu Neal during his days in Atlanta was when he absolutely wrecked Jimmy Graham at the goal line, right? Like that's a choice that you're making. And so that's what I mean, where it's like how you feel about Thomas Dimitroff is based off of your choice. You can choose to remember the positive, you can choose to remember the negative, right? And so that's just a choice, right? You want to focus on hits, you want to focus on the misses, right? So that you tell me, right? You tell me, Seb's Dad 19, how does this affect your memory of Thomas Dimitroff during his time here? But our last question comes also from the Discord. This comes from Harry and Gary. He says, "Hello, Aaron. I know this is far ahead, but Lindstrom is guaranteed $48 million in 2027. Wouldn't that ruin the team?" Well, Harry and Gary, I think you have some of your facts incorrect. He's not guaranteed $48 million in 2027. He's guaranteed $48 million, or technically I think $48.2 million at signing. And that includes $27.5 million signing bonus that he got on this 5-year extension. He also, the guaranteed at signing is his 2023 base salary, which is $4.2 million. His $4 million roster bonus that he's also due this year, and then his 2024 base salary, which is $12.5 million, which adds up to about $48.2 million in guarantees at signing. In 2027, Lindstrom is due a $2 million roster bonus, which will give him a cap hit of about $23.25 million. But the Falcons could potentially move on from Lindstrom well before that, potentially as early as the 2026 offseason, because Lindstrom's 5-year extension, which is basically a 6-year deal, attacking on 5 more years to the existing year left on this contract. This extension is really just a 3-year, $63 million deal, right? So it's locking him up through the 2025 season, and then we'll see, right? And then, when Lindstrom gets, I think he'll be like 29 or 30 after that point, and we'll see, he continues to play at a high level to justify the Falcons paying a huge premium for him, or will we, it'll be a similar situation that we've seen the last couple of years with Jake Matthews. Like, do the Falcons, redo a deal, extend him, restructure, all that various things. So that is really what's, looking ahead to Chris Lindstrom in the future. So that 2027 figure, we'll see if he gets to that, and we'll see what, adjustments that are made accordingly in the meantime. But that's going to do it for us guys on today's episode, probably a little shorter than usual. But there's some other questions that you guys asked that I do want to get to, but I won't get to on today's episode. We'll just punt those into a future episode. One, which was asking, did we overpay for Taylor Heineke? Someone sort of putting forth the idea that the Falcons could make a fully guaranteed contract for Lamar Jackson work. And, I think that's, even though Lamar Jackson is not coming to Atlanta, it is worthwhile talking about it as a possibility, because, there may be a future where, the Falcons are looking to make a trade for a player of Lamar Jackson's or Lamar Jackson's specific caliber in the future. But it's worth, sort of figuring it out. And we'll talk a little bit with Jesse Bates, or about Jesse Bates, with the Locked On Bengals co-host Jake Lisco as well this week. And I want to get into some deep dives after watching the film of not only Jesse Bates, but David Onyemata, Kaden Ellis later in the week. I do want to talk to Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta later this week. So lots of things in store for you guys all this week. So continue to make us your first listen. And for your second listen, make sure you check out the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast with the Draft Dudes. It's just a couple of guys being dudes, and Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino taking you through what it takes to be a successful NFL franchise every single day. Find Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.